In the latter part of 1967, Fiji Airways introduced the Hawker Siddeley HS748 aircraft, and they were to replace the Heron aircraft on their overseas routes, which were to Honiara in the Solomon Islands via Port Vila in the New Hebrides, to Tara in the Gilbert Islands via Funafuti in the Ellis, to Faliolo in Western Samoa, and to Tonga. Fiji Airways aircraft, the HS748, it was a Series 2 aircraft, built in 1967 and registered as Victor Quebec Foxtrot Alpha Lima. Now, originally designed and built by Avro company as a DC-3 replacement, the first 748 flew in June 1960. Avro later became part of the Hawker Siddeley group, and hence the HS designation. The Series 2 entered production in 1961 with a higher takeoff weight and Mark 531 Rolls-Royce Start engines, and configured for about 40 passengers, which after the limited capacity of the Herons was a huge advancement. Fiji Airways aircraft was the last of the Series 2 by serial number before the 2A model came online, but its engines were the same Mark 532 darts as used in the Series 2A. We had real hostesses on the large aircraft instead of the engineers. Our chief hostess was a Fijian princess, Andy Latia Thackenbauer, and she became a good friend. There were several other Fijian and an Indian hostess. So we engineers no longer served the self-loading cargo with meals or refreshments. We mainly rode the jump seat on the flight deck, and sometimes back in the cabin if there were spare seats. Or in the beginning of the operation we had multiple crews, so there definitely wasn't room for us on the flight deck. Neil Thompson, who's a local guy, and myself were among the first Fiji Airways lamies to be granted Fijian DCA maintenance authorities on the 748 and Rolls-Royce Dart engines by passing a fairly rigorous examination by the new British Airworthiness Officer, Mr. Ron Cooper. He was UK Air Registration Board Officer on secondment to Fiji. The manufacturers, Hawker Siddeley and Rolls-Royce, had provided training courses in Fiji. One of the British instructors commented that he'd been told before he left home that there would be no language problem in Fiji, but they forgot to warn him about the bloody Australians. He discovered that kick it in the guts and light it up meant start the engines. I did the travelling engineer's duties on the second 748 flight into Faliolo in Western Samoa. It was my first 748 trip and should have been straightforward, turn around, back to Fiji the same day, hopping over the international date line each way. And I should have been more switched on, as my mate Neil, having been the engineer on the first flight a week earlier, he'd warned me to watch out for the refueler because he didn't have a clue about what he was doing. In fact, Neil's comment was something like, if clues were shoes, this bloke would be barefooted. I'd asked Neil how he'd arrived at that opinion, and he told me the refueler was a young Kiwi bloke who was a counter jumper for Burns Philp, the trading company, and they'd made him the aircraft refueler. He'd asked Neil when he should mix the water methanol into the fuel. Neil's glib answer really didn't clearly answer the question and probably contributed to my problem. A week later, he just said, it has its own tank in the aircraft and we mix it later. And water methanol mix is used for power augmentation on takeoff on hot days and sprayed into the compressor region of the engine. It's very common on Rolls-Royce Darts and some Garrett engine installations. The Fiji Airways had equipped us with a beautiful little fuel testing kit in a nice wooden box consisting of a long graduated glass cylinder, a hydrometer, a thermometer and a chart, so we could check the fuel-specific gravity. We also had the good old shell pellets and syringe for testing for water contamination. I don't know why we bothered to test the fuel SG, because what we would have done if it was not within specification. Also, I'm not sure that the volume of fuel we were dealing with would have had too much effect on the weight and balance of the aircraft. So I climbed down out of the aircraft, eager to get the refuelling done, and so we get back home. On greeting the refueller, I asked him if he'd carried out the water checks on the mobile refueling unit. And this refueling unit is looks like a shoe. This is one that's over in the museum. It's about 500, 600 gallon capacity, but that's really not much effect on what happened. I knew that the previous week's flight had taken 200 imperial gallons of fuel. Anyway, the refueler's response was yes, he'd done a water check, and yes, there was water in the sumps. So I'd asked him what he'd done, had he drained the water out, and he was very pleased with himself, and he said no, that he'd mixed it up by circulating the fuel through the system with the delivery nozzle running back into the tank filler. Now, I don't know how much water there had been in the tank, but they hadn't topped it up, so we had a 200 gallon airspace sitting there. It was the middle of the wet season, and so that's it was generating water in that tropical air for a week. The airport's approximately 14 degrees latitude south, so it was, as I say, it was the wet season. And this water had been well agitated into the kerosene, and I believe the correct term is emulsified for the cookery people amongst us. So free water will precipitate out of kerosene at a nominal rate of about an hour per foot head. But not in this case, it wasn't going to come out at all. And kerosene is hydroscopic. It will absorb water, and the amount of water that it absorbs depends on the temperature. Water comes out of the fuel into suspension as fuel cools down. So I quickly made a decision we weren't going to get clean fuel out of the aircraft on this day. And the aircraft wing was cold, having just come down from whatever altitude we'd cruised across from Fiji, and the fuel remaining on board was quite chilled. So the bottom of the wing was covered with heavy condensation, and I was unable to get a clean drain off the aircraft, even though we'd tried to wipe it away. Plus the water that had been absorbed into the fuel aboard at normal temperature had come out of solution and was now in suspension. So those water detection pellets, they're very sensitive, and they're very good for drum stock or out of fuel farms, but they're really no good for checking fuel out of an aircraft that's been flying. They start to change colour at about 10 parts per million water, and fully colour up at 30 parts per million of water suspended in the fuel. So to put that into perspective, my rough calculation says that's between 2 to 6 teaspoons of water in 1,000 litres. So this is in addition to water that's been absorbed by the fuel anyway. We needed 4 44 gallon or 200 litre drums of fuel as a minimum to get back to Fiji legally. And so when asked where the fuel's stored, the locals pointed up the hill to the other side of the airstrip. There's their fuel farm. So how do you get it over here? And the answer was, well, we roll the drums. So that didn't excite me at all. So I asked them to get the drums over by the aircraft without doing that. And then I asked them what sort of pumping equipment was available to get the fuel out of the drums, excluding, of course, the mobile unit, because that was well and truly contaminated. So this is what they found me. For the filtering, they found me a metal funnel and an old chamois leather, and that was stored in a jar of fuel. And the pump there was a garden type stirrup pump, and we had about 30 or 40 foot garden hose. Fortunately, the pump reached almost to the bottom of the drum. But also, fortunately for me, as far as the crew goes, I was the bottom of the totem pole. And those early 7 or 8 flights, we carried double crews, so 2 captains, 2 FOs, So the captains were left to worry about having to cancel out and return to Fiji and to organise the overnight stop. We had a busload of passengers, mostly Yanks on tour, and they were as happy as pigs in mud to get an extra night staying in the famous Aggie Graves Hotel in Apia. It was Saturday back in Suva, so we didn't get any assistance from home. And this is well before mobile phones, so basically we were on our own. We carried some manuals on board the aircraft, and I took the Rolls-Royce one home to the hotel that night for some light reading. And I found that Rolls-Royce did actually list the chamois as an acceptable filter medium. So next morning I checked out the refuelling unit, and it was still giving instantaneous contamination indications on the test pellets. I did get good test results of the aircraft, so that was okay. All the condensation had gone and the fuel on board had warmed up. So we took nearly 2 hours to transfer fuel from the drums, which had been tested for water, into the aircraft using the stirrup pump and the funnel and whatever. Everything nicely bonded together with the leads off the mobile unit. And I learned to say faster and slower in Samoan that morning, so that we kept the fuel at a suitable level in the funnel. Flow through chamois is not very fast. I don't know if you've done that sort of thing. Eventually we had enough fuel on board and we headed home across the international dateline to Fiji. And of interest, in 2011 the international dateline was shifted east, putting Samoa into the same day as Fiji. All on paper. The engineering manager was there to greet us at Nasuri Airport, and he didn't say, well done Gordon, good initiative, or any such thing. All I got was a flea in the ear for using a chamois, because Qantas had recently banned the use of chamois for filtering because there was slight risk of static electricity discharge. He actually, as manager, had failed to communicate to the troglodytes doing the work. So anyway, at least I hadn't contaminated the aircraft. It was subsequently done a few months later by the East African hangar foreman when he hijacked a trip up to the American Trust Territories from one of the experienced engineers. And we were draining black sludge out of the wing every fuel drain for weeks after that. Because he wouldn't admit that he'd stuffed up and allow us to remove the wing panels and clean the tanks. That black stuff is Cladosporium resinae for those that are really not interested. I don't know what the engineering manager had expected me to do to ensure I got clean fuel into the aircraft. He never did offer any constructive suggestions. And I developed an intense like for that bloke. I mean, after all, the chamois was good enough for Kingsford Smith when they'd refuelled the Southern Cross out of drums at Nasalai Beach in Fiji back in 1928. On takeoff, in the tropical conditions, water vapour poured out of the air conditioning vents just above the passenger seats. Much to the excitement of the passengers, it just had a 20-hour delay due to water contamination on that particular flight. You would have seen the same thing here in the wet season up north. My first flight into Tara in the Gilbert Islands was interesting. It was still very early in the introduction phase, and we still carried double crews except for the engineer. Plus we had a traffic officer to train the locals. The hotel was one of those places that only opened on aeroplane days, so we would have somewhere to sleep. The manager's name was Peter Barker. Anyway, when we checked in, someone asked Peter what was on the menu for dinner that evening, and nothing was the reply. The British Commissioner's wife has invited the whole crew to the Commissioner's residence for dinner, so the hotel's not putting on a meal. And the official car came along at a set time and transported us to dinner. This was my first flight to Tarawa since we'd had the unbalanced Gilbertese lady on my Heron flight. I still remember the look of horror on the Commissioner's wife when she opened the door and saw all the crew. And her comment was something like, "Oh, I hope there will be enough food." As you can imagine, out there in Tara, there's no fresh food other than what the locals, Gilbertese, grow or catch and eat. Anyway, we were mindful of the food situation, and when it turned out to be a very large serving bowl of some curried mince concoction and rice, everybody took small servings and it tasted pretty ordinary. So nobody went back for seconds, and there was more than enough to go around. I think we sat on cushions basically on the floor, and it was as boring as hell. So some of the crew went to sleep. Relatively early in the evening, the senior captain made our excuses that it had been a long day, and we all got out of there. In all, it was a social disaster. Poor lady was only trying to make friends with the crew, as most people did, in the hope that fresh food supplies may be brought up from Fiji. So the Commissioner's driver took us all back to the hotel, and some of us dispersed for more exciting nightlife. My last 7 or 8 flight was into Honiara in the New Hebrides. I only actually did 3 flights in the 7th or 8th before we mutinied, and I was banished to do my 3 months notice period doing tarmac duties. But that's another interesting story. The airport, Henderson Field, was being upgraded from the wartime crushed coral strip. The terminal building had been built, and the strip was in progress of being bitumen sealed from each end. The middle third was still unsealed coral. On this particular trip, instead of landing straight away, we were in a racetrack holding pattern, low level off the coast. I was back in the cabin. And then a male passenger sitting on his own about halfway down the cabin started to panic about why we weren't landing. And you could see the panic starting to spread to the other passengers around him. So as there was an empty seat alongside him, I went and sat with him and assured him we'd land after that big black cloud moved away from over the top of the runway. So because of that very heavy downpour, the unsealed section of the runway was mud. They covered our nice new aeroplane with coral mud. In particular, the main undercarriage was covered. And the Fiji Airways Deputy Chief Pilot, nicknamed David Niven of the South Pacific because of his sunglasses, was the command pilot, and he decided we should wash down the aircraft. And that was a fair call because we really didn't want to have that mud gumming up the system. The local airport fire service had recently been given a lovely big red airport fire tender complete with a foam monitor. And the fire crew were very proud of their new machine. So when the captain asked for assistance, they were overjoyed to be able to play with their new toy. They reeled out the small hose from this fire tender. It was a bit like a garden hose, only a little bit larger diameter. And we asked for water and nothing happened. And they couldn't figure out how to get water out of that hose. So they then ran out 3-inch hose and whacked a brass nozzle into it. And I don't know if you've ever hung on to the end of one of those fire hoses. It can be a bit daunting. So there I embraced, not really knowing what would happen in the circumstances, and nothing was happening again. And then all of a sudden the small hose, which had been dropped on the ground, started to whip round like a cut snake. So we captured that and washed the mud off the aircraft, and we parked up, went to bed. We found out later the Australian DCA Fire Service blokes had been up to Honiara and had rated this group at 5% efficient. I sure as hell would not have wanted to have them coming to save me if we'd needed their services. So another uneventful night. Can't recall anything. But I was on the jump seat for the flight deck for the takeoff. And climbing out after departure, I decided to go back into the cabin when they'd switched off the seatbelt sign. As I stepped into the cabin, there was a bloke on an aisle seat about row 3. He looked up and spots me. And at the top of his voice he calls out, "G'day, Gordon. What's going to go wrong today?" Well, he and I knew what that was all about, so we were both laughing our heads off. But it didn't do much for the other passengers. The bloke's name was Arthur, and he was a travelling salesman for a Sydney flour mill. And our paths had crossed on a couple of flights in the recent months. And there'd been minor dramas, but nothing out of the ordinary for Fiji Airways, just ops normal stuff. So the first time I met Arthur was in Tara on the Heron flight bound for Nauru. It was a special charter from Tara and return, then all return flight back to Fiji. We had one official passenger who was from an Australian university and was going to help the Nauruan people write their constitution for their independence scheduled to happen in 1968. So on the return leg, we were to have two young teenage American girls whose parents, I think, were working on the route. So we had to take them back to Fiji so they could home to the States. Peter Barker, the manager of the hotel, decided he wanted to visit Nauru, and after the travelling salesman happened to be in Tara on business, he decided he'd like to get on the act. This was the first time Fiji Airways had ever had a flight from Tara to Nauru. So I don't know who approved them come along for the ride, but there were 3 passengers for the flight to Nauru. I briefed the passengers, seatbelts, life jackets, exits, follow me, etc., and returned to my seat at the back of the cabin. So we taxied down to the far end of that, and we're lining up, and the captain called me up, and he tells me that we've got a dead magneto on number 2 engine. So I say to him, you've got 7 more, so what's the problem? And the captain, he doesn't like my logic. But I explained that it should be okay to get to Nauru, and we could discover the dead magneto that afternoon, and we could pull it overnight, stop at Nauru. But Heron will fly okay on 3 if you have to shut one down. The FO was all in favour, but the captain was a good company man, and he vetoed that plan. So we taxied back to the terminal and kept the sick engine running, so it was stinking hot when I had to change the magneto. So the FO entertained the passengers under £1 change, and the captain, after giving me a hand to lift the cow off, he went and stood on his own palm tree while I sweated over that hot engine. So eventually get underway after I changed the bag and we installed the cow with the captain's help. So it's about 450 miles down to Nauru from Tara, and there we were met by a big officious Australian Commonwealth cop that sort of gives them a bad name. Firstly, he got really excited about the 2 extra passengers and wouldn't allow them away from the aircraft. And then he really spat the dummy because none of the crew were carrying passports. We never did, and he just couldn't come to grips with that. Fortunately, at least the extra passengers had their passports, so anyway, he eventually relented and allowed the crew to be taken to a mess for lunch, which had been part of the original plan, but the extra passengers, they weren't allowed from the aircraft. So somehow in the drama we forgot about the bag of official airmail that we'd been carrying in the nose locker in the Heron. And I don't think it was deliberate, but we were not sorry when we did find it back in Tara. It had to go back to Fiji, then to Sydney, where it was sent by the next ship to Nauru. My 2 young American passengers were a pain in the backside. Me being a smart-ass and feeling multilingual, I offered them some cookies, which generated the response, Australians don't have cookies. So my response to that was, well, have a biscuit. And I was really glad to see the back of them when we finally got them back to Nandi. So that was my first meeting with Arthur, and I did meet up with him again on a Saturday morning. I was trying to get a Heron to fly to Samoa, but we were having a little bit of trouble with some lights inside the cabin, and there was a cyclone or a hurricane coming through, and in the end the flight was abandoned due to weather, but Arthur and I had a bit of a chat because of our previous experiences. So one of our captains was having a hard time transitioning from Herons to the much larger 748, and on one landing he really drove it into the ground, so much so that there was creases in the aft fuselage, and both engine nacelles knotted, putting creases in the skin behind the nacelles. The engines are a cantilever type. So the creases behind the engines, they were stop drilled, but the back end wasn't. Fortunately, we had a couple of tech reps with us, and they contacted the UK, and it was all okay to keep flying. But yeah, a bit embarrassing for the captain. I wanted to find out what had happened to this aircraft, so I did a bit of searching using Dr. Google, and on the internet I found a register of all HS748s that had ever been built. The aircraft left Fiji, it was then Air Pacific, in June '76. It went to Dan Air in the UK. We carried British registration there. And it was then leased to the Philippines Airlines from October '84 to May '89. Then back to Dan Air in May '89 to be sold to Springer Aerospace and leased by them to another operator in Ottawa. And I found out that the aircraft had actually been burnt during an unloading accident in Canada and written off. And that happened in August in 1991. 1991, when a fuel cargo was being unloaded. The 748 aircraft had been modified to carry fuel in big bladder tanks in the fuselage as cargo, in the fuselage cabin as cargo. And that was all sorts of fuels, and it was to get them into the remote indigenous communities in northern Canada. Yeah, that event happened at a place called Big Trout. I like the names of Canada. That was on the 14th of August, and 2 days later it was flown out of Big Trout to Bar River, and it was then deemed to be a write-off. So the aircraft was just pardoned out for spares. Yep. So thank you very much.